It wasn't supposed to fail. One of these films didn't just flop. It nearly collapsed a studio. How does a movie with massive budgets, global stars, and non-stop hype lose everything? Because 2025 broke the rules. Budgets spiraled, audiences disappeared, decisions fell apart behind the scenes. This isn't just a list. It's what Hollywood doesn't want you to see, and it only gets worse. 15. Hard Eyes. It looked like an easy win, low budget, viral-ready concept. A horror-romance hybrid timed perfectly for Valentine's season. And for a moment, it worked. Opening weekend showed promise. The premise, love twisted into something violent, had just enough novelty to attract attention. But that attention didn't last. Because once audiences walked in, something didn't hold. The tone never settled. Was it satire? Horror? Romance? But that confusion didn't just affect reviews, it affected word of mouth. And word of mouth is where smaller films either survive or disappear. Within days, the drop-off became visible. Screens reduced, showtimes shrank, conversations stopped. Financially, it didn't collapse instantly. On paper, it even looked like it might recover. But marketing costs, those invisible numbers audiences never see, quietly turned a moderate performer into a loss. And that's what makes this entry important. Because not every box office bomb explodes dramatically. Some fail quietly. No headlines, no outrage, no controversy. Just a slow realization that the audience never truly connected in the first place. 14. Caught Stealing. It had all the right ingredients: gritty tone, recognizable faces, and a grounded crime story that felt closer to reality than spectacle. And yet, almost no one showed up. This is the kind of failure that confuses studios the most, because nothing about it looks obviously wrong. The performances were solid. The direction was controlled. The story, tight enough to hold attention. But something critical was missing. Urgency. Audiences didn't feel like they needed to see it now. And in modern cinema, later often means never. Streaming has changed behavior. If a film doesn't feel like an event, it becomes optional. And Caught Stealing felt optional. That single perception quietly erased its theatrical life. Week after week, it didn't collapse. It just faded. No dramatic backlash, no viral criticism. Just absence. Which is, in many ways, worse than failure. Because at least failure means people noticed. And this barely registered at all. And for a mid-budget film, that kind of silence is where the real damage happens. 13. The Woman in the Yard. It starts with a feeling. Not fear, something quieter, something distant, a presence that shouldn't be there. That was the promise. A slow-burn horror built on atmosphere rather than shock. But atmosphere only works when audiences stay. And here, they didn't. The pacing asked for patience. The tension built gradually. Too gradually. Modern audiences, trained by faster storytelling, didn't wait for the payoff. And without that payoff, the entire experience felt incomplete. Reviews didn't destroy it. They just didn't defend it either. Which created the worst possible middle ground. No strong praise, no strong outrage, just indifference. And indifference is fatal in horror. Because horror depends on reaction. Fear, shock, discussion. Without those, it becomes forgettable. And that's exactly what happened. A film designed to linger vanished almost immediately, leaving behind a question that quietly defines many 2025 failures. What happens when a movie asks for more patience than the audience is willing to give? 12. Black Bag. This wasn't supposed to struggle. A polished thriller. Recognizable cast. A concept built around secrets, power, and controlled tension. Everything about it suggested stability, But stability doesn't sell tickets anymore, because audiences aren't just choosing what to watch, they're choosing what feels urgent. And Black Bag never crossed that line. It didn't look risky. It didn't look groundbreaking. It looked safe. And safe has quietly become a problem. The marketing emphasized tone, not spectacle. Subtlety, not scale. Which created a gap. Critics understood it. Audiences didn't prioritize it. And in that gap, the film lost momentum. Week by week, it slipped further down. No collapse, no backlash. Just a steady decline into irrelevance. And that's what makes this entry unsettling, because nothing went visibly wrong. No scandal, no controversy, just a film that did everything correctly and still failed. 11. Hurry Up Tomorrow. It had attention before it even released, not because of the story, but because of who was involved. That kind of attention can be powerful, but it can also be misleading. Because curiosity doesn't always convert into tickets, the marketing leaned into mood, abstract visuals, emotional ambiguity, a tone that suggested depth but didn't clearly explain what the audience would experience. And that's where the disconnect began. People were interested, but not convinced. The film didn't promise a clear journey. It promised a feeling. And for many viewers, that wasn't enough. Opening numbers reflected that hesitation. Not disastrous, but far from strong. And once the first wave passed, the drop was immediate. Because films like this rely on conversation, interpretation, debate. But when audiences leave unsure, not intrigued, just uncertain, they don't recommend it. They move on. And that's exactly what happened here. A film designed to feel different ended up feeling distant. And distance, in a crowded year like 2025, was enough to push it out of relevance almost instantly. 10. The Smashing Machine. This wasn't built for mass appeal, and that was always the risk. A raw, grounded biographical story, focused more on psychology than spectacle. That approach can work, but only when audiences feel a reason to engage. Here, that reason never fully formed. The tone was heavy, uncomfortable, and deliberately so. It didn't soften its subject. It didn't simplify the character, which made it authentic, but also difficult to market, because authenticity doesn't always translate into commercial pull. The trailers didn't offer excitement. They offered intensity, and intensity, without a clear payoff, can feel exhausting before the film even begins. So audiences hesitated, and hesitation, once it spreads, becomes momentum in the wrong direction. Opening weekend reflected that. Not a collapse, but a warning sign. Then came the second week. What the drop wasn't just noticeable, it was decisive. Because once viewers categorize something as serious rather than must-watch, it moves down their priority list. And in 2025, that's where films disappear. 9. Love Hurts. On the surface, it looked simple. Action, romance, familiar structure. The kind of film that doesn't need to surprise, just needs to entertain. But that's exactly where it struggled. Because familiarity, without energy, feels repetitive. And audiences recognize the pattern almost instantly. The tone felt predictable. The pacing, uneven. Moments that were meant to land emotionally, passed without impact. And once that connection breaks, everything else becomes harder to recover. The opening numbers were already weak. Not catastrophic, but fragile. And fragile films don't survive bad word of mouth. Within days, the decline accelerated. Not because people hated it, but because they didn't care enough to talk about it. And in modern cinema, silence spreads faster than criticism. No debates, no viral reactions. Just a quiet drop in interest, which turned a modest production into a clear financial loss. Because even smaller films need momentum, and Love Hurts never found it. 8. The Alto Knights. This one felt important. A classic crime setup. A performance-driven story. A tone that aimed for legacy rather than trend. And that's exactly why expectations were higher. But expectations can become pressure, and pressure exposes every weakness. The pacing felt deliberate, but audiences read it as slow. The performances were controlled, but audiences wanted intensity. And the story built carefully. But viewers expected immediate engagement. That gap kept widening. And once early reactions leaned negative, the damage accelerated. Because films like this depend on credibility. If audiences believe it matters, they show up. If they don't, it collapses quickly. And this one collapsed. Not gradually, not quietly, quickly. The numbers reflected it almost immediately. A sharp drop, a loss of screens, a rapid disappearance from conversation. And what makes it worse? This wasn't a niche experiment. It was designed to feel significant. But significance only exists if people experience it. And here, most didn't. 7. Christy. This one didn't fail loudly. It failed before most people even realized it existed. No major buzz, no strong push, no moment where it felt like an event. And that's where the problem started. Because in a year like 2025, visibility isn't optional. It's survival. The film itself wasn't aggressively bad. It wasn't controversial. It just didn't stand out. The marketing struggled to define it. Was it emotional? Inspirational? Dramatic? That lack of clarity created hesitation. And hesitation is deadly on opening weekend. Because if audiences don't understand what they're getting, they wait. And when they wait, they often never return. The release came and went with minimal impact. No strong reactions, no viral clips. Just a quiet presence that faded almost immediately, which makes this entry different. It didn't collapse under pressure. It simply never gained enough momentum to exist in the first place. 6. Mickey 17. This one hurts differently. Because everything about it suggested success, a respected director, a unique sci-fi concept, a scale that demanded attention. And yet, the numbers told a different story. Technically, it didn't look like a disaster. The gross seemed strong, but that's where perception becomes misleading. Because budget, and more importantly, marketing, changed the equation completely. What looked like success was actually loss. And that realization hit slowly. The film asked audiences to engage with ideas, identity, repetition, existential questions. But mainstream audiences weren't looking for that. They wanted clarity, momentum, immediate payoff. Instead, they got complexity. And complexity, without urgency, creates distance. The opening was decent, but the drop revealed the truth. Interest wasn't sustained, which turned a high-profile release into one of the year's most deceptive failures. Because this wasn't a film people rejected. It was a film people didn't return to. 5. Mission: Impossible, Final Reckoning. This wasn't supposed to be here. A global franchise, years of built trust, a name that usually guarantees attention. And yet, something shifted. The scale was bigger, the action more extreme. But instead of excitement, audiences felt fatigue, because familiarity, over time, stops feeling like comfort and starts feeling like repetition. The film delivered what it promised, but that was the problem. It didn't surprise anymore, and in 2025, surprise matters more than consistency. The opening was strong enough to create confidence, but the drop was impossible to ignore. Week after week, an interest declined faster than expected because the audience had already seen this world, already experienced this formula. And this time, they didn't feel the need to return. The final result wasn't just disappointing. It was expensive, because when a film of this size underperforms, the losses aren't small, they're massive. 4. Tron Ares. It had legacy, a recognizable name, a visual identity people remembered, and the promise of something modern built on something iconic. But legacy can be dangerous because it creates expectations that are almost impossible to meet. The visuals were there, the scale was there, but something else was missing. Connection. The film looked impressive, but didn't feel essential, and audiences can sense that instantly. The marketing focused on spectacle. But spectacle alone isn't enough anymore. People need a reason to care, and that reason never fully formed. The opening showed interest, but not commitment. And without commitment, films don't hold. The drop was steady. Not shocking, but unavoidable. Which turned a high-budget production into a financial risk that didn't pay off. Because in the end, looking powerful isn't the same as being memorable. 3. Snow White. This is where everything changes. Because this wasn't just a film. It was a project surrounded by expectation, scrutiny, and constant attention. From the beginning, something felt unstable. Not in the production, but in the conversation around it. Debates started early, opinions formed before release. And once that happens, the outcome becomes unpredictable. The budget kept rising. Marketing expanded. Everything about it signaled confidence, but confidence doesn't guarantee connection. When the film finally released, the response wasn't explosive. It was divided. And division creates hesitation. Hesitation affects turnout, and turnout determines everything. The numbers came in below expectations, then dropped, then kept dropping, until the reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just underperforming. It was losing money at a scale that studios don't recover from easily. Because when a project this big fails, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads across strategy, across future decisions, across the entire studio. 2. Captain America: Brave New World. This wasn't just another release. This was supposed to prove something. That the franchise could continue, that the character could evolve, and that the audience would follow, no matter what. But for the first time, that assumption didn't hold. The marketing pushed scale, importance, a sense that this chapter mattered, but audiences didn't feel that urgency, because something had quietly changed. The connection to the character wasn't as strong, the stakes didn't feel as personal, and when emotional investment drops, so does everything else. The opening weekend showed signs of concern, not catastrophic but weaker than expected for a film of this size. Then came the second week, and that's where the real story revealed itself. The drop was sharper than it should have been, which signaled something deeper. People weren't returning, and they weren't recommending it either. Because franchise loyalty only works when the audience still believes in the journey. And that belief felt uncertain, and uncertainty is dangerous at this level, because films like this aren't built to perform moderately. They're built to dominate, and when they don't, the gap between expectation and reality becomes the loss. 1. Thunderbolts. This was the gamble. Not a guaranteed hit, not a familiar formula, but a calculated risk. Built on the idea that audiences were ready for something different. A darker team. A morally uncertain narrative. A shift away from traditional heroes. And for a moment, that idea felt exciting. But execution is where everything changed, because different only works when it still connects. And here, that connection didn't fully land. The tone felt inconsistent, not fully grounded, not fully entertaining, which created distance. And distance, in a film like this, spreads quickly. As the opening numbers reflected curiosity, but curiosity doesn't sustain a film. Engagement does. And engagement dropped faster than expected. Week 2 confirmed it. The momentum was gone, and once momentum disappears, recovery becomes almost impossible. The financial impact wasn't just disappointing, it was significant, because this wasn't a small experiment. It was a strategic move, a test of direction, and when a test like this fails, It forces a question studios can't ignore. Was the audience not ready? Or did they already move on? It didn't happen all at once. It happened film by film, decision by decision. Because these weren't just failures. They were signals. Audiences are changing, expectations are shifting, and the formula that once guaranteed success is starting to break. And so the real question isn't which movie failed the hardest. It's what Hollywood does next. Because if these lessons are ignored, the next collapse won't be one film. It'll be an entire system.